Welcome again, everyone, to the start of our fall lecture series on literature hosted by the Antrim Literature Project. For those of you who may have just discovered us or are watching on YouTube, we're an online public humanities platform run mostly by graduate students in English or other literary fields who want to share their love and knowledge of literature with others. And so these lectures are public. They're also free to anyone with a link. And head over to our website. You can find that in the description below to this video if you want to find out more opportunities regarding the reading groups and lecture series and courses we'll be running in the future. Our third speaker today is Allie Stapleton, who is joining us virtually on a pre-recorded talk. She'll be joining us live after the talk for Q&A. So I'm happy to introduce Allie. She is a former student of Wheaton College. She now studies at Yale University in the Divinity School, and she's going to be introducing to us the poetry of Anne Carson.
You've already gotten a little introduction, but
all right, awesome.
I'm currently at
Thank you
Yale
so much.
Divinity School. I study religion and literature here. And I wish I could be with you tonight live, but I'm recording this, and then hopefully I'll be on for a little bit of Q&A afterward. And I'm talking with you about Anne Carson, who is one of my favorite writers, a contemporary writer and translator, whose work I think can most closely be categorized as experimental poetry, which brings us to three big questions. Who is Anne Carson? Why do I say that she could be categorized as experimental poetry? And why should we care about her? All great questions, so we'll just jump into them in order. First, who is Anne Carson? Most of the about the author sections in her books are pretty spare, almost comically so, given the really wide range of work that she has created. In almost every book, her bio reads, Anne Carson was born in Canada and teaches ancient Greek for a living. So to give a slightly fuller picture of her, I'm going to share an image of her here with you guys. All right, so here she is. And I think this gives you maybe a sense for her and the feeling you get from her. A little elusive, a little severe. And also, the way that I think about her, maybe unexpectedly from this image, think of her as a very playful writer. She can be a little intimidating to encounter because her work is, simply put, it's kind of weird. It's experimental, which we'll get to later, what we mean when we say that. But the goal of my talk tonight is just to give you some entry points to work with that will hopefully apply not just to Anne Carson's work, but also to that of other experimental writers. So Carson began her career as a classicist, a scholar of ancient Greek language and culture and history, did her PhD in classics, and her first book, like a typical academic, was a modified version of her dissertation, published by Princeton University Press in 1986. And we can see her evolution from there, mainly by looking at the presses she's been working with since then. So more recently, she's still publishing today. Most of her books are published by New Directions, which some of you may know is an indie press, publishes a lot of formally experimental work and a lot of poetry. So this brings us to our second big question of formally experimental or experimental writing. What does that mean and why does it apply to Anne Carson? So here is an example of what I mean. This is Knox, which Anne Carson published in 2010. And it looks perhaps like a book, but then you go turning the pages like so, and you see that the form itself is a physical part of the way you encounter the object. You realize that the form, not just the lines on the page, but the physical form really matters when it comes to Anne Carson. So with this kind of text, which is maybe the weirdest of all of her texts, we get the opportunity to close read not just a text, but the materiality of that text, the text as an object. So remember that Carson is a classicist, that pithy little bio she has, born in Canada and teaches ancient Greek for a living. So drawing from her classics roots, maybe we can think of an object or a book like this one as an artifact that we encounter outside of its original context, and which might feel a little strange to us at first. Some of you here probably know a little more about archaeology than I do, but perhaps like archaeologists, we can do a close reading of the object itself to give us some clues about its meaning. So just so you guys can hopefully see a little bit better what I'm talking about, I'm going to share my screen again. All right, so this is what Knox looks like, kind of all laid out. We see that it's all connected in this accordion style. Pages are all connected, and as you can kind of see here, when it's all laid out, the pages are filled not just with text, but also with photos, text fragments, postcards, splotches of paint, stamps. It's like a reproduced scrapbook, and maybe a collage, and just a really puzzling object that you can sit and read and flip through, but you can also stretch across an entire room if you want. So the strangeness of this object brings us to that second question about formally experimental poetry. Why should we care about it? And does something like this even count as poetry? As people who enjoy literature, why would we want to pick this up when we could pick up a more traditional text that we can hold in our hands or even read on a screen? Carson also calls this text an elegy. It's about a brother that she was estranged from who died after years of silence in their relationship. So why does she need to represent this in such an unwieldy way, and what does she gain by experimenting with this form? So this kind of brings us to that third question I raised of why should we care about Anne Carson? Why might a text like this be meaningful? And this gets to the question of what poetry is, or what literature is. Literature is language that's crafted in a particular way, that pays attention to the way that it's crafted. Texts like Knox immediately confront us with the question of why they are put together or constructed in the way that they are, because they're kind of weird. They immediately disorient us. And what I want to suggest for you to consider about Anne Carson is that her disorientation and the quality of that disorientation in a book like Knox is not designed to ultimately disorient us. I actually think that the weirdness of her texts offers a kind of poetic hospitality, a way of arranging disparate fragments that can create an entry point into things and into experiences which overwhelm us. So this is kind of the question or problem that I think Anne Carson is fundamentally interested in, and that I think helps us read her. And that's the question of what do we do with the things we can't fully get our arms around, the things we can't understand or express. How can we craft something? How can we make something out of language in a way that helps us hang on to those things or some pieces of them, even if we can't grasp their entirety? That's what the formally experimental asks us to do. It asks us to try and get our arms around something we can't quite immediately understand. And it also offers us a way to do that. The formally experimental text itself is playing around with forms in an effort to do that. Or at least perhaps Anne Carson is, and we're going to try to read her that way tonight. So for our last little bit of intro to Anne Carson, I want to just give you her directly, talking about this idea of things that we can't get around. I'm going to share with you a little video. It's a lecture of Anne Carson's called A Lecture on Corners. Carson has several of these lectures that are kind of poetic academic performance pieces. Her work is kind of always jumping across these boundaries of different genres and different media, as we see in Knox. Some of her lectures are accompanied by choreography. This one is not. But I want us to think of this lecture also as a kind of poetry. Anne Carson is making things with language in it, trying to give us a way of inhabiting ideas and concepts that get beyond us. So here, we will see a little bit of her classics background at work as she's taking apart this Greek word apeiron.
The Unbounded, in Greek apeiron, a word formed by adding the negative prefix alpha to the noun peirar, which is thought to mean rope end. Unboundedness is a rope not tied off at the end to prevent its unraveling. The first person to use this word as a metaphysical value, the philosopher Anaximander, described to apeiron as the arche of all things, arche meaning origin, first cause, first principle, or beginning. And in Aristotle's account, the unbounded is abhorrent because it is nothing but beginning. Aristotle says, nature flees from the unbounded. The unbounded is imperfect or incomplete, and nature always seeks completion.
What she says in this section about the rope end and the unraveling might remind us a little bit of this kind of unraveling text of Knox, this kind of messy unboundedness, physically unbound without a spine. Unboundedness is a rope not tied off at the end to prevent its unraveling, she says. And this book in some ways threatens to unravel or fall apart. Not only in its physical form, but maybe also in our minds. A lot of us might feel this way about just the general weirdness or unwieldiness that happens in experimental writing, Carson's or writing from other people. We kind of ask this question of what can we hang on to? What keeps us from just sliding into a general unraveling, not knowing what it means? So to answer this question, this lecture, her lecture on corners, has been very helpful to me. And I think about Anne Carson spatially. Her texts make me wonder what kind of space a poem is creating. So let's listen to just 2 more minutes of her here to see how she thinks about corners with the Unbounded. I'm going to screen share one more time.
Corners, Part 3. So, on the one hand, we might regard corners as shelter, comfort, containment, completion, what Stevie Smith calls 4 walls and a pot of jam, something valued for their boundaries and useful in their form. On the other hand, the phrase "to be cornered" can signify a wish to escape or dissolve or deny the threat of angles closing. Let's say you're losing an argument, or retreating from an enemy army, or you're a fox on Saturday morning in a ditch outside Downton Abbey. And then on third hand, there are people who want or need cornerlessness for its own sake. I once gave a lecture at the European Graduate School, located in a small town high in the Alps, and was taken by car up one of those death-defying switchback mountain roads that circles round and round the edge of an abyss. We were passed by several buses hurtling down the road in the opposite direction. I asked our driver about accidents on the road, and he confessed he had wondered the same thing when he first moved to the area, and had gone to the local bus company to ask for actuarial statistics. The bus company told him they'd in fact never had a bus crash on the road, but that 4 times in their history, A driver at some point mid-route had steered his bus to the side of the road, stepped out, and quietly dropped himself over the side of the mountain. The lure of the abyss may be fatal, or it can be domesticated into a desire for infinite going, restlessness, wanderlust, walks. You don't have to hit the ground to experience cornerless space.
You don't have to hit the ground to experience cornerless space. What is she talking about here? She is talking about bus drivers. She's talking about another English poet, Stevie Smith. She mentions Downton Abbey. And somehow, improbably, she's also talking about exactly what she told us she was going to be talking about, which is corners. So again, let's look at this lecture itself as a piece of poetry, as something crafted or made to hold incongruous, disparate pieces together. And Anne Carson is telling us about corners here, but she's also creating one. A corner, she says, is a space where two incongruous things, seemingly oppositional walls, instead of missing each other or cutting into one another, actually connect. They don't align with each other, but they meet and they open into something new. And in just these 3 minutes that we've watched, Carson is giving us a lot of oppositional walls. She's talking about Greek words, Aristotle, this story about traveling up the mountain. She talks about suicide. She talks about the abyss. But at the end, that line, you don't have to hit the ground to experience cornerless space. I am curious about that line. And that curiosity guides the way I think about Anne Carson. Can we think of an Anne Carson poem or a text like Knox as a corner, as one of those domesticated abysses that hold both the unbounded and the bounded at once, that kind of hold, that threaten to unravel, that threaten to be unbounded, but somehow still give us a kind of form. They hold something for us. So I think Anne Carson's poetic paradoxes, her bringing together of these things that don't seem to make sense together, as actually a way of creating corners. And I think of this as an act of poetic hospitality. She invites the reader to inhabit what they don't know, not as this fatal, fearful, unbounded abyss, but as a space of embrace, this kind of sheltered corner. The poem as a corner becomes not a fearful space, but one of exchange, where the writer meets the reader, meets the poetic subject, and they interact with one another. So let's return to Knox. Let's see if this theory of the corners actually works, if it actually helps us make any sense of this disorienting poem object. Which I will say, again, is best encountered in person. And I'm going to do my best to give you a taste of it through the screen digitally. But hopefully, if you have the chance to encounter this at a library or to borrow a copy from someone somewhere, it is really best interacted with as an object. But we're going to do our best. So I'm going to give you some images again here. So this is kind of our full picture of Knox once again. And here's the first kind of fragment we're going to look at. It starts with this translated Greek word, multos, numerous, many, many of, many a, many people, many women, the ordinary people, the many, especially in phrase unus de multis, one of many things, much, to a great extent, many words, especially in elliptical phrases, for example, quid multa, ne multa, to cut a long story short, an abundance of, much, large, multum est. It is of value, appearing or acting on many occasions, assiduous, regular, used many times, or of persons, too much in evidence, tedious, wearisome, verbose, occurring in a high degree, full, intense, multa dies or multa lux, broad daylight, multa nox, late in the night, perhaps too late. And then she has the first fragment of a kind of poetic essay that appears in these numbered sections broken up throughout the book. And it reads, I wanted to fill my elegy with light of all kinds, but death makes us stingy. There is nothing more to be expended on that, we think. He's dead. Love cannot alter it. Words cannot add to it. No matter how I try to evoke the starry lad he was, it remains a plain, odd history. So I began to think about history. So this is the first text we get from her in Knox. We're going to look at this opening sequence of 4 panels. Again, Knox sprawls in one continuous text. There aren't natural breaks, but just to close read it together, we're going to break it up into just to zoom in on specific parts. So let's look at this just visually at this sequence of 4 panels. Materially or visually, what is Carson drawing our attention to? My eye immediately goes to all of the blank space here. This blank space as a part of the poem. We have the 3rd page in this sequence, which is entirely blank. And then the 4th, which has just this one photo, a little bit off center, surrounded by blankness and very dark. If you look closely, it seems to show 2 children sitting together, but their faces are kind of obscured. And this dark photo contrasts with what Carson is telling us in the essay fragment. She says, I wanted to fill my elegy with light of all kinds. So immediately we see that her project is interrupted. She can't proceed with it as easily as she wants. This obstacle appears, that obstacle that is death. But, she says immediately after, there's that hard stop, the declarative sentence. But death makes us stingy. Love cannot alter it. Words cannot add to it. No matter how I try to evoke the starry lad he was, it remains a plain, odd history. A plain, odd history. Carson is introducing us here to the problem of genre. She's already mentioned elegy. Here she mentions history. And facing this page on the far left of your screen, we have a 3rd genre, which is her doing translation, this kind of lexicon, which also runs throughout the text with different Greek words, Latin words. I'm sorry, this is a Latin elegy that she's translating. So we have in just this opening sequence multiple contradictions at play. We have contradictions of genre, elegy, history, translation. Genre tells us how we're going to tell about something, how we're going to speak about something, norms we're going to use. So she's already sort of telling us that we're going to need to experiment with things. There are multiple genres going on, multiple ways of thinking about this death. There's the contradiction of light and dark, the desire for light that she expresses, but then the hard stop of death. And there's this dark photo with the lit windows in the background, those contradictions. And finally, a contradiction in the text itself rather than immediately on the page of absence and presence. So though Carson hasn't told us yet, the mention of elegy and death alert us to the fact that somebody's gone, somebody has died, somebody's absent. And Carson is trying to create something to hold on to their presence, to evoke the starry lad he was, she says. But that effort is frustrated, and it requires or prompts this searching for the right form. Her turn to history at the end. I began to think about history. This absence and presence paradox, which is reflected also in this play of blank space and filled space in the pages, will continue throughout the book. So let's turn to a fragment that's a little farther along. We see the lexicon continuing here, and this text fragment from that same essay that runs across all the pages. It says, when my parents died, I chose not to eat, but to burn them. Then I buried the ashes under a stone cut with their names. For my brother, I had no choice. I was 1,000 miles away. His widow says he wanted to be cast in the sea, so she did this. There is no stone, and as I say, he had changed his name. This is followed by another blank page with like some remnant of, maybe a staple or some kind of connective something almost scanned onto this page. And then the following little poetic fragment at the bottom, floating there, removed from any other context, which says, fish are abundant, yet the nets rest, full of shadow. So what are we to make of all of this together? We have the continuation of the essay, and this particular fragment of it brings us back to this theme of absence and presence, as it talks about what we do with the bodies of the dead. Carson's brother in his death is presenting another problem here. The body that's cast into the sea, the absence of a stone, the changing of his name. There's no place where his body exists or where it's marked. And this makes him unmournable. This section of the poem, this particular fragment, has the potential to feel like that fatal abyss that Carson mentions in her lecture. No meaning can be made. Nothing can be remembered. Nothing can be held on to. He simply can't be mourned. There is no place to do that. But then we travel over this blank page and we see this floating poetic fragment. Fish are abundant, yet the nets rest, full of shadow. And I want to draw our attention to this line, full of shadow, because it's a paradox within a paradox. How can a net be full with something that's by its nature nothing, just shadow, darkness, the opposite of the light that Carson said she wanted to fill her elegy with? So there's something happening here with absence. Yet as we continue to page through the book, this highly material physical thing, there is some sense of presence. There's that fullness of shadow. So maybe this is a book that's chock full of shadow. This textual space where the absent is paradoxically present. Let's take a look at just one final fragment. We have the lexicon continuing with Frater, and then we have this fragment of the essay. Prowling the meanings of a word, prowling the history of a person, no use expecting a flood of light. Human words have no main switch, but all those little kidnaps in the dark. And then the luminous, big, shivering, discandied, unrepentant, barking web of them that hangs in your mind when you turn back to the page you were trying to translate. So here we have Carson giving us maybe a little bit of herself, of her work as that translator that we've been seeing through the book. And she's kind of cluing us in here to this odd, strange, disorienting lexicon that she's been including all the way along. And this is a move that Carson likes to make in other texts. She has these moments, these kind of ars poetica moments, where she's sort of revealing herself as writer and giving you this little clue into, embedded within the text, this is what I'm doing here. This is what I'm doing in the text that you're reading. So she gives us a little bit more of this sense on the next panel. This fragment here interspersed with the photo, which says, take the word entry as used of the arrangement of the contents of a lexicon. So this is a fairly simple sentence. We can read it as a poem broken into these lines, but just the way it sounds is maybe not particularly poetic. It's more instructional, like something you would find in a textbook. Yet within this textual environment that Carson has created with all of these together, this made, crafted space of the poem, of this whole text, This sentence is hugely meaningful. And in fact, it kind of seems to break open the poem for us. Again, considering Knox as a whole as the poem, something that's trying to craft something out of language. So we see with these fragments that maybe entry is what she's offering us here. In the fragment we just read, Carson equates prowling the meanings of a word with prowling the history of a person. And she returns to the problem of the elegy filled with light that she began with. And she says, no use expecting a flood of light, because human words have no main switch. So this line, human words have no main switch. We can't turn the light on. This might suggest to us again that fatal abyss where no meaning can be made. There is no light at all. There is only mess, confusion, absence, and absence of meaning. But instead, or at the same time, Carson gives us this idea of the entry. She calls them little kidnaps in the dark. And we end with this haunting, ambiguous, but not entirely unhopeful image of the luminous, big, shivering, discandied, unrepentant, barking web that hangs in the mind. This language is thrilling and strange and specific. It's granular in the same way that Carson's kind of running lexicon has been throughout. So perhaps we can turn back now again to this idea of the corner, having looked at these different pieces of Knox and seen this kind of collage-like, disparate, fragmented nature of it. Going back to this idea of the corner to kind of think about what can we do with all of this? What is Carson asking us to do with it? So in this collage-like, disparate, fragmented way, Carson has created a point of entry for herself and for us into her brother, into this opaque object, which a person who was estranged from her, a person whose body she cannot find, cannot mourn. Knox, as a text, has created a way of seeing something that is absent, a way of being with what is not with us. And Carson has used these contradictions of genre, history, elegy, and lexicon. We could add more to that list, but those are the three I'll point out, to create something that's not a single one of them. Perhaps Knox is a collage, or it's a monument, or it's something else entirely. But the oppositions of these genres all meet in the text to create something new. She's also brought the contradictions of light and dark together in this paradoxical image of the luminous web of kidnaps in the dark, in the midst of this dark prowling of the meanings of words and persons. And finally, this contradiction or paradox of absence and presence that are brought together in this act of memory that she's doing, in creating a physical presence through the book in this space of absence. So viewing Carson's textual space allows us to appreciate, perhaps, the poetic hospitality of this text. Viewed in this corner-like way through the frame of the corner, the fragments of the text become not confusing incompletions, sort of gifts of a kind, spread across the pages of Knox like an offering, the way she sprinkles these different artifacts through this long scroll of pages. Knox gives us this fundamental question that we asked earlier about experimental poetry. What do we do with things that we can't get our arms fully around? How can we craft something that holds all the pieces, both of what we do and what we don't understand? Remember, experimental poetry is presenting us with that question and attempting to craft an answer itself. And that's what Knox, I think, is also doing. That's why it matters for us. What I want to offer from Carson is this practice of making corners. In this space of total disorientation, the disorientation of this strange, collaged, fragmented, odd, disorienting text. In that space, she invites us to play with the pieces of what we do have, to set them down, not in order to see where they align or match up, but to look at where they meet and how they meet, and explore what kinds of space that cornered meeting can build. So often a paradox, like the ones we've seen in this text, form a corner that opens into something else entirely. And that corner can hold the pieces that don't quite fit together. It can hold them and it can do something new with them. It can open into that third space. The corner is a space we can sit in and be held by. To return to Carson's phrasing in that lecture, the corner offers shelter, comfort, containment, completion, 4 walls, and a pot of jam. All these inviting things in a space or in a kind of text where we wouldn't expect it. But my hope is that the corner allows you to experience Anne Carson's writing and other experimental forms that might strike us as strange or disorienting, as possible spaces to be embraced or to be held as corners. That's what I have for you on Anne. Thank you so much for being here. And I'm excited to talk about questions with you.